On December the 3rd, 1886, Sage Hollow woke under a sky the color of forged steel and a temperature of 9 degrees below zero, measured at dawn on the church porch where frost had feathered itself into the grain of the post, like white lichen. The settlement stood in a shallow bend of Wyoming territory, one rail spur cut into the prairie, one church with a bell that cracked 2 winters earlier, and one general store owned by Silas Pemberton whose front windows shone with lamp glass and imported cloth, while the wind moved dust and snow along the boardwalk in thin, bitter sheets. 312 souls lived there by the autumn ledger. By the first week of December, flour that cost 5 cents per pound in October stood at 14 cents, and coffee had climbed beyond what many day laborers could justify. The winter had not yet begun in full force. Sage Hollow was already paying as though it had. Ray Tucker stepped into that cold before sunrise with a shovel on her shoulder and a burlap sack of ash in her left hand, her coat patched at both elbows, her boots oiled with tallow against split leather, her breath brief and sharp in front of her face. She was 29 years old, broad in the wrist, narrow in speech, and known in town less for what she said than for what she carried. Beside her came Owen Tucker, 13, long-limbed and serious, still growing into his boots and trying, with imperfect success, to keep the same pace. They worked a marginal creek-bottom claim north of town, where spring flooding left silt and stone in unequal measures, and where respectable men had told them no sensible family would stake a future. The Tucker place had one lean shed, one dugout room roofed with timber and sod, and a slope of ground that looked poor for wheat, but useful for something most neighbors did not recognize until too late. Their mother, Elena Tucker, had come west from a Finnish winter culture, where cold was treated as a fact to be planned, not a mood to be feared. She had taught by demonstration and repetition, never by comfort. She showed Ray, then 12, how earth held steady warmth below frostline, how stone gathered daytime heat and released it through night, how venison dried best when smoke stayed cool and continuous, and how hard bread sealed in rendered fat could outlast seasons if kept dry and dark. She died in the spring of 1881 when a wagon tongue broke on the grade above Rollins and the team overturned in river runoff, leaving Ray 17 years old, with Owen still in swaddling years, and a notebook of measurements written in Finnish and English side by side. Elena had learned from her own mother near Oulu, and from a grandfather who trapped along frozen inlets and survived by storing for storms he could not predict by date. That chain crossed an ocean and landed in Sage Hollow through one daughter who did not survive long enough to see whether her lessons would be honored. Ray honored them in the only way available. She counted. She measured. She prepared. In good weather and bad, she tracked jars by weight, salt by scoop, firewood by cord fraction, and daylight by work section. She and Owen did day wages when offered, mended fences for ranchers who paid in coin or scrap iron, and sold 2 rabbit pelts at a time rather than one to avoid price pressure at the counter. Most weeks they purchased what others called drudgery goods: pickling salt, lime for wash, waxed thread, spare barrel hoops, rough pine for shelving, and common glass jars whenever they appeared in Pemberton's inventory. They did not buy sugar unless the price dropped below 12 cents per pound. They did not buy ribbon, tobacco, or patent tonics. Their table was plain: rye, beans, onions, dried greens, and whatever meat they had smoked or trapped. Silas Pemberton watched them from behind his polished counter with an expression that combined amusement and accountancy. He was 44, heavy through the middle in a way that spoke of steady meals, with watch chain bright against a dark vest and cuffs, cleaner than any laborer's shirt in town. He carried himself as if the town itself had been ordered through him by catalog and freight receipt, and in practical terms that was close to truth. If a household required lamp oil, seed, coffee, nails, cloth, or flour, that household passed under his eye and his prices. He extended credit where it secured loyalty and called debt where it secured obedience. The Tuckers had little leverage in either category, so he offered them courtesy without warmth and occasional advice they had not requested. By November, he had started asking, loud enough for others to hear, whether Ray meant to tunnel all the way to Cheyenne before spring. Sage Hollow repeated such remarks because repetition cost nothing. Men on the boardwalk called the Tuckers diggers. Women who had never entered the creek bottom claims said the siblings lived like badgers. Boys followed Owen for half a block one market day, stamping hard on frozen dirt and shouting that he had dirt under his nails because he was half buried already. The cruelty was not theatrical. It was ordinary, and therefore constant. Ray answered with the same composure she used on weather and tools. When Owen slammed a bucket harder than needed and asked why they should keep listening, she tied a sack of potatoes in the root chamber, closed the hatch, and said, "Let them talk. Words do not keep out the wind." By the second week of November, their project had moved from intention to visible form. Ray marked a rectangle on the south rise behind the dugout, 22 feet by 16, with twine and stakes cut from willow. She set the depth at 7 feet at the uphill wall and 9 feet at the downhill wall, allowing a drainage pitch of 1 inch for every 4 feet of run toward a gravel sump. She and Owen cut sod blocks in squares near 18 inches wide, stacked them flesh side down to cure, and carted fieldstone from the creek for a retaining face 2 feet thick. They worked with 1 iron bar, 2 spades, 1 borrowed hand auger, and a timber saw sharpened every 3rd evening with a file that had lost half its teeth. Labor consumed daylight and then lantern hours. Their palms split. Their shoulders burned. They kept working. The design followed Alina's notebook with adaptations for Wyoming wind. Exterior wall layers ran as stone-packed clay, straw-insulated void, then interior plank, making a total thickness near 20 inches at the coldest exposure points. The roof began as peeled lodgepole beams laid 12 inches on center, topped by brush, then 2 tarred canvas sheets bought secondhand from a freight outfit for $1.30, then 18 inches of tamped earth, then sod. A vent pipe rose at the back corner with a downward elbow to limit direct drafts, and an intake channel entered low on the north side through a covered trench lined in flat shale. Ray whitewashed interior stone with lime and salt to discourage mold, measured shelf depth at 16 inches for jar stability, and left a central aisle 30 inches wide so 2 adults could pass with sacks without striking glass. She placed a stone bench along the west wall, where heat gathered in late afternoon and held there after dusk. In test readings taken with a spirit thermometer she bought for 75 cents, the chamber held between 53 and 57 degrees, while exterior nights dropped below 0. Their provisions entered in sequence, never in piles. Venison strips, smoke-dried for 3 days and rested 1 day, were wrapped in muslin and hung from ash poles. Rye hardtack, baked twice until nearly moistureless, was stacked in tins and sealed with tallow caps. Carrots, turnips, and beets were layered in sand bins, each bin marked by shovel handle notches for quick count in low light. Beans filled 2 oak barrels bought cracked and rehooped. Onion braids hung from rafters where airflow remained gentle. Saltfish from a wagon lot was repacked in smaller crocks to reduce spoilage risk after opening. Owen kept ledger marks on a slate at the hatch: quantity, date, intended draw month, and reserve status in case of blizzard confinement. Ray required that no jar be opened without replacing its cork and wiping the rim dry. Waste was tracked in ounces. Money left their hands as steadily as the wind left heat from loose-built homes. Between August and early December, they spent $11.82 on salt, jars, and lime wash, $4.10 on nails and strap hinges, $2.50 on spare canvas and twine, and $1 on rendered tallow when hunting returns fell short. They did not owe Pemberton credit. They also did not possess his favor. When Ray requested 12 more jars on November 29th, Silas charged full shelf price and told a customer nearby that some folk would rather hide food underground than trust honest commerce. He said it with a smile that invited laughter, and laughter came. The name arrived on a clear morning in early December, when Ray and Owen hauled the final barrel into the earth-sheltered room and set a cedar hatch over the entry stair. Silas stood at the edge of the lot with 2 ranch hands, collecting a payment dispute, looked down at the half-buried structure, and announced that Sage Hollow had acquired a new landmark, Tucker's Tomb. The phrase traveled faster than weather. By sundown, boys were saying it at the pump, men were saying it outside the church, and even those who pitied the Tuckers used the name because resistance to mockery required courage they had not practiced. Ray heard it 3 times before dark and once again at dawn, and when Owen looked toward town with his jaw set hard, she handed him the measuring rod and told him to mark the day count through March before breakfast. On December 11th, 1886, the morning temperature fell to 12 degrees below zero, and the wind came out of the northwest in long level strikes that made the telegraph wire hum like a saw blade. Owen stood at the table with the measuring rod laid beside him, notching their ration board in clean half-inch cuts that marked 1 day each from December 12th through March 20th, while Ray weighed dried venison on the brass balance and shifted 3 pounds from common reserve to storm reserve after hearing that sound in the wire. In Sage Hollow, warning often arrived first as vibration, loose shutters rattling before the gust, mule teams turning their heads before the squall, church glass singing before the full front hit. By noon, the rail office posted a paper notice nailed crooked to the outer wall, and the notice altered the practical future of every household in town. Freight contracted from the North Platte Crossing had diverted south after axle failures in the drifts. No replacement shipment could reach Sage Hollow for 6 to 8 weeks, and perhaps longer if the pass sealed. The notice drew a crowd within 20 minutes. Men read it twice. Women counted aloud what remained in their pantries. Boys were sent running for fathers and older sisters. At Pemberton's store, line pressure formed before the first bell ring from the church tower, though no service had been called. Silas opened both front doors and took position behind his counter in a wool coat trimmed in black braid, his face composed, his ledger open, his pen already dipped. He did not deny the danger. He translated it into price. Beans rose to 80 cents for a small sack by late afternoon. Lamp oil reached $1.20 per tin. Common flour crossed 16 cents per pound before dusk and did not hold there. Those with cash bought quickly. Those with credit pleaded. Those with neither drifted toward the back wall and watched shelves the way thirsty men watch a shallow creek in August. Ray came in once before sunset, purchased only 6 pounds of coarse salt and 2 rolls of waxed thread, and paid in coin counted flat into Silas's palm. He looked past her shoulder, found 3 listeners near the stove, and said with smooth contempt that the town had no reason to panic simply because some folk had buried their larders and prayed to dirt. Then he asked whether Tucker's Tomb accepted visitors now that proper commerce had become strained. The line heard him. Laughter came from 2 men who had bought sugar they could not afford. Ray did not raise her voice and did not alter pace. She said, "We store for weather, not for applause," took her parcel and walked out with Owen into a dark that had already begun to snow. That night they changed schedule. The work moved from preparation to management, and management demanded discipline more exact than strength. Ray set 4 ration classes on slate: daily use, severe cold use, whiteout confinement, and communal emergency if outside households failed. She marked jars by a charcoal ring at neck height so Owen could sort them by lantern in seconds without reading labels. She tied wool tags to every rabbit snare line at 20-yard intervals, each tag cut in a different corner pattern to signal direction when the land flattened under drift. She set snow fence markers from split pine slats, 6 feet high and 8 paces apart, from their hatch to the spring path, from spring path to shed, and from shed to smoke pit, creating lanes that could be followed by touch if sight vanished. Before sleeping, she checked the wall thermometer in the buried chamber again. 55 degrees. Stable. Elena Tucker's lessons remained present, not as memory but as method, and method now controlled every hour. She had taught Ray that winter defeated households by sequence. First confidence, then fuel, then judgment, then food. A house could look sound and still die by poor order. Keep heat where bodies sleep. Keep water where fire can reach it. Keep food where frost cannot split it. Never open all stores at once. Ray repeated those rules to Owen while they packed turnips into fresh sand bins and rotated onion braids 2 handspans apart for airflow. He answered with figures. At current draw, beans lasted 101 days. Hardtack, if quarter-pound portions were observed, lasted 112. Smoked venison varied by trim thickness but held through April if trap lines produced even moderate rabbit return. They had 2 1/3 cords of mixed cottonwood and scrub pine, not enough for careless burn, but sufficient for measured fires at dawn and dusk with ember banking through night. By December the 14th, Sage Hollow began to divide between those still planning and those already bargaining. 2 ranch foremen rode north requesting hay allotments from larger outfits and returned with little because surrounding claims faced the same shortage and guarded their stacks. A church committee visited Pemberton to request a fixed price pledge for staples through January. He declined, citing uncertain replacement cost and freight risk, and suggested that prudent families ought to have purchased earlier when rates were lower. The committee left without agreement. 3 days passed before dispatch sent any update, and the update gave no comfort. Drifts at the pass measured shoulder high on a mounted man, and 1 mule team had turned back with frostbitten stock. Silas continued to dress like prosperity while his stock diminished by row and crate. He carried himself with the same polished certainty, but the margins beneath his eyes darkened and the shop stove burned hotter than before. Fed with split oak he had purchased in October at low cost, and now guarded behind the back door. He extended credit only to families likely to pay by spring cattle sale, and he refused both Tuckers outright when Owen inquired about Lampwick by barter of rabbit pelts. No credit for diggers, he said, then corrected himself with a smile toward 2 waiting customers. No credit for tombkeepers. Owen stood still through the insult, bought 1 wick with coin and left. At the claim, the siblings added a second interior curtain to the hatch stair, using canvas stitched with old blanket wool as dead air baffle. Material cost had been 40 cents for salvaged cloth and 12 cents for needles and thread. Heat loss dropped enough that Frostline retreated 6 inches from the inner lintel by next morning. Ray installed a drip shelf beneath the vent elbow to catch condensation, then emptied it at noon and dusk to prevent ice choke. She widened the gravel sump channel with the hand auger and packed lime around the drain mouth against rot. Owen reinforced jar shelves with diagonal braces cut from wagon slats, scavenged in summer, each brace set at 45 degrees and pegged, not nailed, to reduce split under humidity shift. On December 18th, they rendered 2 kettles of tallow and resealed 48 hardtack tins, spending 3 full hours on wax seal inspection alone. Waste was a 1/4 cup. Acceptable. The town did not see those hours. It saw only the half-buried roof and repeated the name given by the wealthiest counter in Sage Hollow. Yet contempt began to strain against observation. Near the pump, one widow noted that smoke from the Tucker flue rose thin and steady, while taller houses belched and failed. A teamster remarked that Ray's snow markers remained upright after gusts that toppled signposts on Main Street. The remarks did not become praise. They became unease, because unease asks whether laughter had been mispriced. On the evening of December 20th, Peter Lynn came to the claim carrying a folded message from his father, who oversaw freight records at the Spur office. Peter was 14, all elbows and earnest breath, with mittens patched in 2 colors. He handed the paper to Ray and waited by the door while Owen fed the stove. The message confirmed what rumor had already suggested. Southbound diversion had become full suspension until track crews could clear cutbanks and rebuild one collapsed trestle approach. Earliest arrival for Staples was now estimated at the first week of February under favorable weather. Unfavorable weather made no promise. Ray read the line twice, then asked Peter whether households were still buying, as if supply remained nearby. He said yes. He said some were buying extra because they feared others would buy first. After Peter left, Ray and Owen lifted every sack in storage and updated true weights by lantern, then reduced their own daily ration by 2 ounces each to stretch communal emergency capacity if called. They converted fence rails into stove-length bundles tied with hemp, stacked them under lean-to cover, and marked each bundle in charcoal with burn date sequence so green wood would not be taken ahead of dry. They moved 1 barrel of beans from lower shelf to mid-shelf for rapid access during sheltering and repacked cracked corn into smaller cloth bags to avoid opening the whole barrel in damp weather. At midnight, they tested rope travel between Hatch and Spring in blowing snow, each tied by waist loop, each counting paces allowed at marker posts. 27 paces to first turn, 19 to well cover, 23 to return rise. They repeated the route until both could walk it with eyes closed. By Christmas week, the false calm appeared, a 2-day softening with afternoon melt that put thin shine on wagon ruts and tempted households to burn extra wood, wash extra clothes, and believe the worst had passed. Ray watched the runoff freeze overnight into glass ridges that would snap axles when covered by powder, and she sent Owen to reset every snare twice daily because rabbit tracks showed nervous, erratic crossing instead of the broad loops seen in settled weather. Geese moved south in low, hard lines despite the date, and creek ice thickened from 6 inches to nearly 10 in 4 nights. Signs accumulated in plain sight. Acceptance did not. On December 28th, at a supply discussion outside the church, Ray spoke once in public and only to facts. She stated remaining rail uncertainty, advised household rationing by weight rather than by meal guess, and offered to demonstrate root cellar insulation for any family willing to dig before full January freeze. Silas answered before the pastor could. He said panic had many faces, and one of them wore work gloves and called itself caution. He said respectable homes did not turn themselves into burrows because of temporary freight delay. A few nodded. A few looked away. No one accepted the offer that day. When night fell, Ray returned to the claim, checked Owen's knotwork on the rope bundles, and posted a new slate beside the hatch. External aid none. Internal order strict. Share if asked. She stood a long moment with her hand on the cedar frame, then banked the stove, sealed the inner curtain, and prepared for January as if it had already begun. The next morning came without color. Only a pale strip above the eastern ridge and a wind that moved dry snow across the claim in low, hard ribbons. Ray rose while the stove still held embers, set a kettle over the grate, and handed Owen a new slate list before first light touched the shed roof. He read it once, nodded, and pulled on his gloves without comment. Reinforced south wall berm, deepened the ash pit, split fuel to match 10-day burn cycles, and begin the second crawl trench from storage chamber to smoke pit so food could be moved under cover during a whiteout. They ate rye and onion in silence, then stepped out into a morning measured at 14 degrees below zero. Work proceeded by sequence rather than urgency, because urgency wasted strength. Ray paced the south berm with a marked rod, drove stakes at 3-foot intervals, and had Owen shovel pack drift against the existing earth face until the insulating bank reached 4 feet thick at its base and tapered to 18 inches at the hatch corner. She mixed straw, clay, and ash in a hogshead, adding 1 bucket of water at a time until the mass held shape. Then pressed the mixture into gaps between stone and timber, where frost had begun to thread fine white veins. At noon, she checked interior wall readings with the spirit thermometer. 54 degrees on the west bench, 52 at the floor line. Acceptable spread. She recorded the numbers in Elana's old notebook under the date and adjusted vent aperture by a 1/4 inch to reduce upper chill pockets. By New Year's Day, they had extended the storage system into something larger than a single cellar and smaller than a public refuge. Though Ray had begun calculating it for both, the new crawl trench ran 14 feet from the main chamber to the smoke pit, 2.5 feet wide and just high enough for a sack to pass by drag rope. Owen lined the trench floor with flat shale and sprinkled lime along the sides to slow damp growth. They built a low door at each end from scrap pine, layered with felted wool and tarred cloth, so cold air could be trapped in stages rather than allowed one full run into stored food. Material cost for the expansion stayed under $1.20 because nearly all lumber came from salvaged crate slats and wagon cast-off. Labor cost was their hands. Ray also changed how they held water, which in deep cold could fail a household faster than hunger. She buried 2 oak casks half-depth within the inner chamber, each set on stone blocks above floor moisture, then wrapped both in stitched blankets and canvas so they would not skin over with ice during severe nights. Snow for melt was now sorted by type: clean drift from upper pasture for drinking, wind-crusted yard sweep for wash only, creek ice chips for stock. Owen cut a narrow shelf above the casks where kettle lids and ladles could dry in warmth, reducing mold and frozen handles. On January 4th, when exterior dawn stood at 21 below zero, both casks remained liquid. Ray marked another line in the notebook: water secure. The project grew in ways the town could not see from the road, and that invisibility fed contempt more than proof ever fed humility. At Pemberton's counter, men spoke of the Tuckers as if discipline were a slight against common life. Silas encouraged this by tone and by policy. He announced that no store customer would be served out of turn for private hoarding schemes, though no one had asked him to do so, then began saying that households who buried provisions beyond ordinary need weakened town morale. On January 6th, he posted a chalk notice near the flour bins: credit reserved for established homes and essential trade. No speculative storage accounts. The line was aimed at Ray and Owen as plainly as if their names were written under it. Social penalties followed quickly. At the church wood lot, where families normally swapped labor for kindling rights, one committee member told Owen the allocation list was full, despite 2 open stacks at the fence. At the pump, 2 women ceased speaking when Ray approached with buckets, then resumed loudly once she had gone 10 paces, repeating the phrase "tombkeeper" as if it were settled fact and moral verdict in one. Boys who once mocked from a distance began packing snow into the Tucker gate latch at dusk, so it froze shut by dawn. A small cruelty that cost the siblings 20 extra minutes each morning and delivered laughter from the road. None of it was dramatic. All of it accumulated. On January 8th, Ray entered town with 12 rabbit pelts, a list of supplies, and exact coin for what she expected no one else to sell in quantity: lampwicks, coarse thread, and 2 pounds of saltfish if still available. Silas took the pelts, weighed them, and offered 4 cents less per pelt than the posted rate, citing poor trim. When Ray declined and reached for her bundle, he held it back 1 second too long and asked, loud enough for the stove bench, whether she intended to keep eating underground while decent families shared hardship in the open. A ranch hand laughed and repeated, Tucker's tomb has room for moles, not neighbors. Ray set her coin on the counter, bought only the thread and 1 wick, and said, measured and flat, if hardship is shared, then keep your prices for the hungry equal. No one answered that line. Silas returned her coin with a clipped nod and turned to the next customer as if nothing had been said. The exclusion widened into institution by the 2nd week of January. A relief planning meeting was called in the church hall, and all household heads were asked to attend. Ray came with Owen and stood at the back beside the stove drum. The pastor opened with prayer, then yielded the floor to Silas for supply estimates, because his ledgers were the only full records in town. He spoke for 20 minutes about preserving order, avoiding panic purchase, and rewarding reliable accounts first, so commerce would remain stable. When Ray requested leave to demonstrate emergency insulation methods and ration weights by household size, one councilman answered that such methods encouraged fear and underground habits unsuited to respectable settlement. Another said the town needed confidence, not burrowing. The motion to hear her was never put to vote. Meeting minutes later recorded only that practical suggestions were deferred pending rail resumption. Outside, in the dark, Owen asked whether they should return next week and ask again. Ray tied down the sled rope and said, we will keep the offer open. We will not waste this wind arguing with men who can still feel their feet. 3 days later, the cold sharpened further, and the first warning signs ceased to be subtle. Dogs that usually ranged the alleys at dusk stayed under porches and refused to cross open lots. Cattle on the north pasture turned their backs to the same quarter for hours, heads low, not grazing even where hay remained. Ravens gathered on fence posts in unusual number and then flew south in a single line just before sundown. Ray read these signs in sequence and moved from caution to storm protocol without waiting for consensus. She had Owen double knot the root ropes with gloved hand loops every 10 paces, widened marker tops with cross slats so they could be found under shoulder drifts, and packed one emergency sack at the hatch containing tinder, lint, 2 waxed matches wrapped in oilcloth, and a half loaf of hardtack in case either of them was pinned outside the main door. By January 14th, a brief thaw arrived and tried to persuade Sage Hollow that winter had spent itself. Afternoon rose to 29 degrees above zero. Eaves dripped, and children stamped through slush along Main Street, while men joked that the hardest stretch had passed. Ray watched runoff stream into wheel ruts and noted the hard glaze it would become once temperature dropped again. She spent the thaw window not resting but correcting future failures. She scraped ice from the roof vent collar, reset every outer stake to account for softened ground, and had Owen drag split rails to the church lane and the pump road so marker corridors could be established quickly if drifting erased wagon lines. When asked by a passerby why she worked in melt, she answered, freeze after thaw breaks more axles than fresh snow. Set your path now. The passerby thanked her politely and did nothing. That night the sky cleared to a brittle black and stars burned with a sharpness Ray had learned to distrust. At moonrise a wide halo formed, pale and complete, with a second faint ring outside it, and the wind fell so suddenly that chimney smoke rose straight for the first time in weeks. False calm settled over Sage Hollow like a closed lid. In many houses, stoves were fed high and fast because wood could be cut tomorrow, and in many kitchens extra bread was baked because flour might be cheap again once rail resumed. Ray and Owen did the opposite. They banked fuel low and long, closed inner curtains, and weighed out the next 5 days in advance, each ration wrapped and stacked by date so no one reached into common reserve by mistake. On January the 16th, Peter Lynn came again, this time with no message slip, only his own report after helping his father unload a short local freight of hardware and mail. No staples came with it. No flour, no beans, no oil, no medicine crates. He said Pemberton's back room still looked full from the doorway because empty shelves had been pulled forward and faced with cloth sacks that held mostly chaff. He said 2 families had argued at the counter over the last intact barrel of cornmeal, and that Silas had sold by cup measure at a rate no one had seen before winter. Ray gave Peter a mug of broth and a heel of rye, then asked him to tell his father one thing precisely. If Whiteout closed lanes, the Tucker markers from claim to pump would be open to all, and no household would be turned away from root use. Peter repeated the message word for word before he left. By the 3rd week of January, temperature dropped to 31 below zero at dawn on the church porch, and wind made that number harsher than figures could hold. Stovepipes failed where joints had not been cleaned. 2 barn roofs sagged and collapsed under layered ice, and window frost in plank houses grew thick enough to block lamp glow from the street. Still the town trusted habit more than warning. Men burned through wood stacks planned for 2 months in less than 4 weeks. Families cooked full pots because hunger frightened them, then woke to thin stores and no arithmetic for what remained. Silas continued to sell, continued to rank buyers by account confidence, and continued to insist that order required firmness while his shelves thinned to patched gaps and scattered tins. At the Tucker claim, work continued with the patience of masonry. Ray opened the storage ledger each dawn, called out weights, and had Owen answer with revised day counts by class. They set aside a strict communal emergency tier, not touched, not discussed in town, but ready. They tested shelter capacity in practice by laying bedrolls shoulder to shoulder along marked floor lines and timing air exchange with vent positions, half open, quarter open, and nearly closed. At half open, chamber temperature held 51 with 6 bodies simulated by water barrels and heated stones. At quarter open, heat rose but condensation increased. Ray chose half and noted the trade-off. They prepared not for comfort but for endurance, not for one household, but for a settlement that still laughed when passing the road and still used the name Tucker's Tomb as if mockery could warm a room. Within 4 days, the weather that had threatened from a distance moved down upon Sage Hollow with a force that canceled argument. On January 27, 1887, the church thermometer read 34 degrees below zero at dawn, and by noon the wind had climbed past 40 miles per hour, driving snow not in flakes but in hard, slanting grains that stung exposed skin and erased wagon tracks as quickly as hooves could cut them. By evening, the rail spur had vanished under a single pale ridge, and the town existed by memory more than sight. The first whiteout held for 31 continuous hours. Doors drifted shut to the lower hinge. Chimneys that had drawn cleanly in December now back-smoked as crosswinds struck their caps and forced soot into kitchens. 2 plank houses on Custer Lane lost shutters and then window glass, and families nailed quilts over openings while frost grew on, inside walls in fern-shaped plates thick as a thumbnail. Barn roofs complained under layered snow and ice, each groan carrying across the dark like a warning no one could answer. The wind was no longer weather. It was a tool of pressure, finding every loose board and every gap left by autumn confidence. Ray and Owen moved within their routines as though inside a drill they had practiced for years, because they had. They opened the hatch in timed intervals, never wide, never long, and checked the vent elbow each hour for ice buildup. Owen logged interior readings by lantern mark: 52 near the floor, 55 on the stone bench, 53 by the cask line. The spread stayed narrow. They melted measured snow in covered kettles, fed the stove with pre-bundled lengths cut for predictable burn, and kept emergency sacks by the stair in case someone arrived at the rope markers after dark. No motion was wasted. When the storm eased on January 29th, it did not clear. It paused. Men stepped out to dig doors and found drifts shoulder-high in lee corners and hard-packed crust over open lots where dogs now walked across fences buried nearly level with snow. The thaw that followed lasted less than a day, enough only to wet roof seams and soften roadbeds, before night returned with a sharp freeze that turned every wheel rut into iron. Axles split on hidden ridges. One sleigh runner snapped at the church lane and left a horse limping home with harness trace dragging. Ray watched the sequence from the claim rise and told Owen to reset every route marker before noon, because the second strike would come over ice, not powder. By February 1st, the second strike arrived. Sleet came first, fine and needled, coating timber and wire with glass. Then snow, wet and heavy, fell into that glaze and locked itself there. Temperatures dropped from 12 above at midday to 26 below by midnight, and the whole settlement seemed to contract under the cold, each board and nail sounding brittle in the dark. At Pemberton's store, the front step turned into a sloped sheet despite ash and sand, and 2 customers fell in one morning carrying sacks they had paid dearly to secure. Silas Pemberton still stood behind his counter in vest and coat, but the authority that had once moved through his voice had begun to fracture under arithmetic. He charged $1 for a small sack of beans and $2 for lamp oil through the first week of February, then posted cup measures for cornmeal. Because sacks no longer existed to sell, he kept his ledger open as if account lines could refill shelves. They could not. Flour bins showed plank bottom. Sugar caddies held only crusted residue. Coffee tins were turned upside down and shaken for grounds. He moved empty crates forward to hide bare boards from the doorway, but everyone in line knew what stood behind the display. Space where certainty had been. 3 days after the second storm, a stovepipe failure at the Parsons boarding house filled the lower hall with smoke before dawn and forced 12 adults into the street in nightclothes and blankets, shivering in wind that cut through damp wool. No one died there, but 2 boarders lost fingers to deep cold. Before midday treatment could be arranged, the town doctor had already exhausted his alcohol stock and most clean bandages. Candle ends became currency. Rendered fat was traded by spoon. Kerosene vanished. In homes that had celebrated solid walls and painted trim, cupboards thinned to a few onions, a heel of bread, and hope stretched beyond proportion. The schoolhouse closed in late January, reopened for one afternoon during the brief lull, and closed again when weather settled into its grinding cycle of whiteout, thaw sheen, and freeze. Clara Voss, the schoolteacher, had stayed after dismissal to prepare copy slates and carry a coal scuttle toward her rooms behind the chapel. She met Nora Sorrell, Edith Sorrell's youngest, a schoolgirl of 11, near the pump road when the wind rose fast and visibility fell to less than 20 feet. Clara wrapped Nora in her own heavy coat and pushed her toward the nearest lit door, then turned back for the scuttle and the school keys she had set down near the fence. She did not return. Searchers found her at first light pinned against a drifted gate less than 200 yards from shelter, one hand still closed around the keyring. The town bell, cracked though it was, sounded for her. By February 8th, Sage Hollow had learned to count loss in more than supplies. Amos Hale, who had survived 2 prairie fires and 1 mine cave-in younger years, hitched his old mare after dusk to fetch coal from a private stack north of the rail embankment, intending to bring fuel to 2 elderly neighbors whose stove had gone cold. The route looked passable at sunset. It was not passable by full dark. Freeze crust broke under sled weight near the culvert. The runner jammed and the mare could not pull free. A team found Amos at dawn, seated beside the sled tongue, back against a post, gloves still on his hands and rope looped around his wrist where he had tried to lever the load. He had died within sight of his own lantern, the wick burned out to metal. Another week passed, and the hunger phase began. The one Elina Tucker had warned was always harder to govern than cold, because hunger bent judgment first and dignity soon after. Families boiled bone twice, then boiled it again with flour sweepings. Harness leather was shaved and simmered for broth thickener in at least 5 households along Main Street. At the church, the pastor and 2 volunteers opened a common pot each evening with whatever anyone could spare. But most nights the pot held little more than onion water and a handful of barley. Adults lied to one another about having eaten to spare shame. There was no humor in town now, only work and waiting. Inside Tucker's tomb, the name spoken once with ridicule had become a plain description of the most stable room in the district. The chamber stayed between 50 and 56 degrees, while exterior lows struck 30 below on 3 separate mornings during the second week of February. Shelves remained dry because vent management held. Sand bins did not freeze. Hardtack tins opened without mold. Ray and Owen did not increase their portions despite labor. They cut them by a measured ounce each when rabbit lines came back thin after 2 days of high drift. Owen updated the slate with steady hand. Private reserve 62 days at present draw. Communal emergency tier intact. On February 13th, another death settled over Sage Hollow, quieter than the first 2 and in some ways harder to carry. Jonah Pike, the blacksmith, had spent his last strong days repairing stove grates and broken hinges for anyone who brought scrap, taking payment in kindling, meal, or nothing when there was nothing to offer. He collapsed at his forge after 3 nights of near-continuous labor and too little food, and he did not survive the night despite neighbors rotating warm bricks around him. His anvil stood cold by morning. Men who had argued prices with him in autumn removed their hats when his body was carried past the church fence on a borrowed sled. By the middle of February, Pemberton's store had become the clearest emblem of reversal in the whole settlement. The bright windows still faced Main Street, but inside, shelves that had once displayed imported cloth and polished tins now held spoiled molasses, weevilled corn, and 3 dented cans of peaches priced beyond reach of most laborers. Silas had stopped wearing his black braided coat and worked in a plain shirt with sleeves rolled, hands inked from frantic ledger adjustments that no longer mattered. Customers no longer asked for choice. They asked for anything. He no longer answered with merchant flourish. He answered with silence, then with refusal, then with a glance toward his empty back room. That afternoon brought the turn that had been coming for weeks. Elias Lynn, the rail clerk and Peter's father, crossed the claim road with Pastor Crowell and Martha Bell, carrying no pretense and no bargaining posture, only urgency sharpened by hunger. Peter walked beside them, bundled and steady, his jaw set in the same hard line Ray had seen on Owen during the worst days. They reached the Tucker hatch near sunset, stamped snow from boots, and waited while Owen lifted the outer curtain. Elias spoke first, voice rough from cold and from words delayed too long. The store could no longer supply even cup measure to most households. 2 older couples had no fuel beyond broken chairs. The church pot would fail within 2 days. Several families had begun melting snow in unclean barrels and were falling ill with stomach cramps and fever. He said plainly what pride had blocked in January. Sage Hollow needed Ray's methods, her stores, and her order, or more names would be added to the bell list before month's end. Ray listened without interruption. She asked for counts, not pleas. How many households had less than 3 days of grain? How many had no working stove? how many adults too weak to dig out their own doors. Pastor Crowell gave numbers from his visitation ledger. Martha Bell corrected 2 of them by street and family name. Peter unrolled a rough map he had drawn with charcoal, marking lanes already blocked and routes still passable by rope. The decision was made in work, not ceremony. Ray sent Owen for the second slate and the bundle of instruction sheets they had drafted but never distributed. She assigned Elias to organize able-bodied adults at First Light for fuel rail conversion and drift cutting. She assigned the pastor to gather vessels, any size, and send them clean if possible, unclean if necessary, because food moved tomorrow whether etiquette approved or not. She told Martha Bell to list households by vulnerability. Elders alone first, then injured, then laborers with no stores. She told Peter to carry one message through town before dark, while visibility held. Route markers from Tucker claimed a pump, and church would be open to all, and no one would be turned away from water instruction. Silas Pemberton arrived while those assignments were still being repeated at the hatch. He came on foot, collar up, hat rim iced white, and stopped 3 paces short of the threshold, as if uncertain whether he had the right to stand there. The man who had named the cellar and sold confidence by the pound held no ledger now. He held an empty grain sack. He asked, with effort visible in every word, whether his household might be included in the first ration circuit if any distribution began. Ray did not answer him differently than she answered the others. She asked how many were in his house, what fuel remained, and whether his back room still held intact barrels that could be repurposed for water storage. When he said yes, 2 barrels and 1 crate of sound jars, she told him to bring them at dawn and to bring his account books as well because paper burned and heat would be needed. Then she looked to Owen, to the map, and to the waiting adults in the snow-packed dusk, and she gave the instruction that altered Sage Hollow from private scrambling to shared survival. She said that she had not built this place to outlast neighbors in silence, but to create breathing space when pride failed and winter closed its hand. Then she opened the inner hatch, and the work of keeping the town alive began. Through that open hatch moved the first sacks, then the first barrels, then the first souls who had spent weeks pretending they could endure alone, and now stood in a line that wound from the Tucker claim to the church lane, each person carrying whatever vessel could hold broth, grain, or instruction. Ray placed Owen at the slate table with chalk and strict sequence, household name, count of mouths, fuel status, illness marks, and route assignment by nearest marker corridor. She placed Elias Lynn at the hatch stair to control entry so warm air did not spill with panic. She placed Silas Pemberton by the stove with an axe, and his own account books stacked at his boots, and told him to split cedar kindling until his hands steadied, and then feed the fire in measured turns, 1 split every 9 minutes, no more. Before full dark, she put the instruction sheets into circulation, each page copied in Owen's clean block hand and weighted with practical detail that could be followed by weary minds. Melt only clean drift from marked upper lots. Bring water to rolling boil. Cool in covered vessels. Ration by weight, not by ladle depth. And build emergency stew from 1 part grain, 1 part root, 1 part rendered fat when meat failed. The sheets were not treated as wisdom by those receiving them. They were treated as work orders from the one system still producing heat and food. By midnight, 47 souls had passed through the chamber in rotating intervals, warming at the thermal wall, collecting quarter-pound rye portions, and returning along rope-marked lanes with fuel bundles tied across their backs. 3 days later, on February the 17th, Ray converted the rescue from emergency distribution to governed sheltering because weather reports from the rail line warned of another major front and local strength had thinned beyond safe labor. She moved preserved goods by class, opening the communal tier for the first time and assigning draw rates by age, labor demand, and illness rather than social standing. Silas received the same ration as any other able adult. Pastor Crowell carried casks to houses with infants and invalids. Martha Bell supervised jar returns and rejected any vessel not scrubbed in ash and hot water. Owen timed warming rotations with a pocket watch borrowed from Elias. 8 minutes near Stone Bench, 12 at mid-floor, then out, so no one collapsed from sudden temperature shift. Order replaced scramble. The walls held. When the March storm arrived, it arrived as if winter had reserved its full authority for one final argument. On March 2nd, wind rose before dawn, and by afternoon drove snow to lintel height on half the homes nearest Main Street, sealing doors from the outside and forcing rescue parties to dig from roof lines down. Ray had preset rope teams in groups of 5, each tied at the waist, each carrying one shovel, one lantern, and one wrapped ember pot for fire restart if a stove had gone dead. Owen remained at the shelter ledger and tracked departures by minute, refusing to release a second team on the same lane until the first had either returned or signaled by 3 rope jerks through the post line. It was not dramatic work. It was disciplined work under mortal pressure. Silas returned at dusk with his coat torn at the shoulder and frostbite spreading dark at 2 fingertips, having spent 6 hours hauling doors clear on Custer Lane under Ray's direct orders. He stood by the hatch waiting for instruction instead of giving it. Ray examined his hands, wrapped them in warmed cloth, and sent him to stir the communal pot, while Owen rebalanced bean draw to account for 20 additional mouths sheltering overnight. That evening, the chamber took in 61 souls in rotating shifts, though only 47 slept inside at any one period. Children and frail elders nearest the warm wall, laborers at the outer row. Boots thawed in sequence so leather would not crack. The account books that had once measured debt fed the stove until dawn. No one remarked upon the irony. There was no room left for that kind of speech. By March 5th, the blizzard broke in ragged gusts, and Sage Hollow emerged not into relief, but into the long arithmetic of survival's cost. Clara Voss, Amos Hale, and Jonah Pike were named in church record as dead of the winter calamity, and their names were read before seed tallies on purpose, so no spring optimism could erase what poor judgment and delayed humility had demanded. Ray attended that reading from the rear bench with Owen beside her, both exhausted, both listening as if the names were tools being set in order. After service, no one called their shelter Tucker's Tomb in mockery. The phrase shifted in public use without declaration, spoken now as direction when giving routes to strangers and as standard when discussing new cellars. Build to Tucker depth, vent at Tucker angle, store by Tucker count. The reckoning did not come as one confession under one roof. It came in a series of visits over muddy days as thaw began and froze again, each visit carrying its own burden of shame, gratitude, defensiveness, and unfinished grief. Edith Sorrell came first, with Nora beside her, and returned Clara Voss's keyring wrapped in cloth because searchers had entrusted it to the school families. Edith said she had repeated the burial jokes in January and had done so where children heard. She said her daughter lived because Clara gave up a coat and because Ray kept the warming line open when lesser houses closed doors. Ray accepted the ring, said Clara's name once, and asked whether Edith would help teach girls to mark ration boards before next winter. Edith said yes, and began the next day. Silas came in the second week of March carrying 2 clean jars and a ledger page folded to show his own price entries from December through February, every increase visible in ink. He did not ask Ray to say he was absolved. He said that he had mistaken scarcity for license and influence for stewardship, and that when he called her work a tomb, he had been protecting his counter, not the town. He said he had sold fear by the pound, and called it order. Ray listened with both hands on the table, then answered without raising voice. She said his words had harmed more than her pride, because they taught others to despise preparation until hunger taught otherwise. She said she would not spend spring pretending that injury had been slight. Then she told him to bring his remaining barrels to the churchyard and help set a public reserve cellar before planting began, and to post fixed emergency prices signed by council if he wished to remain a merchant under this sky. He agreed. He kept that agreement until he sold the store in autumn. Men who had laughed at the pump arrived one by one with shovels and awkward courtesy, asking for wall measurements as though requesting a favor they had once declared unnecessary. Ray gave measurements freely and corrected bad trench angles without insult. She charged nothing, but she demanded precision. 7 feet minimum on high side, drainage pitch maintained, vent elbow shielded, interior lime wash refreshed each quarter. Owen walked lot to lot with a rod and string line, setting corners for households that had never before invited him past their gate. Some offered apologies in full sentences. Some only offered labor and quiet. The change was uneven, but it was real enough to alter the ground. By late March, with days lengthening and the first relief wagons still delayed, Sage Hollow had already begun to institutionalize what it had once ridiculed. Pastor Crowell added a winter preparedness ledger beside baptism and burial records, listing communal stores, fuel reserves, and names trained in cold triage. Elias Lynn established a freight contingency board at the rail office with mandatory ration triggers tied to shipment delays. Martha Bell organized jar sanitation days each October. Peter Lynn, now used to carrying urgent truths without ornament, became the first youth monitor for route markers and weather signs, recording bird movement, ice depth, and livestock behavior for weekly posting. The town did not become wise in a single season. It became less arrogant by practice. Relief wagons reached Sage Hollow on April 6th, after roads softened enough for heavy teams to pass, bringing flour, salt pork, lamp oil, medicine, and mail piled high under canvas. Distribution that year did not flow through private discretion alone. It flowed through a joint committee formed under public vote, with Ray and Owen holding 2 seats despite their age and prior exclusion. Silas transferred ownership of his store before winter returned, accepting reduced value and a freight clerk position under the same rail office that now posted contingency notices in plain language. He kept his hands to paper, not prices. Years passed, and the memory of that winter settled into instruction rather than legend. By 1894, Sage Hollow counted 389 souls, then 402 by 1899, then 428 by the spring census of 1906. Growth measured not only in births and arrivals, but in structures built to endure what plains weather could impose. Earth-sheltered cellars appeared behind nearly every house, some rough, some elegantly stoned, all carrying echoes of one original geometry cut into a marginal creek bottom claim by a woman with a shovel and a notebook. Schoolchildren learned to read by scripture in some, and also by supply ledgers copied from Owen's format. Autumn church socials included work crews for communal reserve packing. No one laughed at lime wash purchases anymore. Ray Tucker never held elected office, though council minutes showed her name whenever weather planning was discussed. She kept teaching by demonstration, correcting vent placement with a tap of the stick, refusing praise that interrupted work, and insisting that generosity required structure if it was to survive exhaustion. She died in January 1912, not in drama, but in her own bed after a brief fever, with Owen and 3 former critics turned students tending the stove in shifts she had taught them decades earlier. The town bell sounded whole for her, repaired at last. The original dugout still stands above the creek bottom rise, roof settled lower, stone walls thick, hatch cedar darkened by weather and hands. A board above the entry bears the words Owen carved that spring after her burial. Store deep, share early, and let no hungry winter find this town unprepared. Children trace those letters with mittened fingers each October when drills begin. Teamsters pause there before first snow to check rope knots and marker stakes. In Sage Hollow, they still say build like Tucker, and they mean not only how to keep a room warm, but how to keep a community human when the wind turns hard. This morning, as those children stood beneath the cedar board, Owen Tucker set the old measuring rod across two sawhorses and called the town to order by the same count his sister had used under storm pressure. Not loud, not theatrical, only exact. The spring census had marked 428 souls, and nearly half of them now gathered on the rise above the creek bottom claim with sacks, jars, rope coils, and slate tablets in hand, waiting for assignments that no one in Sage Hollow treated as optional anymore. The repaired church bell carried clearly in the dry autumn air, its tone no longer cracked. Peter Lynn, 34 and broad through the shoulders from freight years, unrolled his weatherboard beside the hatch and pinned up the weekly signs. Geese flight low and early, creek ice growth at 1 inch in 40 hours, cattle backing north fence before dawn, telegraph wire singing before sunrise with a pitch that old-timers now recognized from January 1887. He had written each line in block letters so schoolchildren could copy them into winter books. No one laughed at animal warnings now. Two boys from Custer Lane argued over whether ravens on east posts meant wind shift by midnight, and an older woman settled it by pointing to the board and making them read the full notation before speaking again. At the hatch table, Martha Bell's daughter, Ruth, named for the child the town had buried that hard February, checked vessels as they came in and rejected 3 jars for poor ash scrub, handing them back with instruction and no embarrassment. Behind her, the last 12 original Tucker hardtack tins sat open for inspection, their tallow seals demonstrated, resealed, and logged. The brass balance Ray had used still leveled true after Peter replaced one worn pivot pin. Elena Tucker's bilingual notebook rested under glass while Owen taught from a copy, turning pages only at the end of each station so no damp fingers damaged the paper. The spirit thermometer, bought for 75 cents before the freight collapse, remained mounted on the west wall and held at 55 in the earth room, while the morning outside stayed at 29. Children were invited down in pairs to feel the difference against their cheeks. They remembered it better that way. By noon, Silas Pemberton had finished unloading 2 wagon barrels and 1 crate of sound jars onto the church dray, exactly as Ray had once ordered when she refused him easy absolution. Age had narrowed him. The prosperous girth was gone, his cuffs plain, his back slightly bowed from years of clerk work at the spur office. But he still moved with care around ledgers and lists, and he still stood when Owen read the names of Clara Voss, Amos Hale, Jonah Pike, and infant Ruthie Bell before the first practice ration was issued. That reading had become fixed protocol. Seed tallies came after. Freight optimism came after. The dead were named first because memory without order had already been tested and found weak. When the ration circuit drill began, the contrast between old arrogance and new practice showed itself in objects laid side by side. On one table stood a single preserved page from Silas's winter price ledger. The inked climb from 5 cents to 14 cents, then upward into crisis rates, each number witnessed and signed by council as historical record. On the next table stood the communal reserve ledger, created after the storm, listing contributions in pounds, quarts, and labor hours, with draw rules triggered by shipment delay notices from the rail office. Elias Lynn, hair now white at the temples, read aloud the latest dispatch outcome. Trestle repairs completed the year after the disaster, alternate wagon corridor contracted, and 2 later winter interruptions managed without hunger deaths because contingency release had begun at 48 hours, not at desperation. Every report that had once arrived as warning now had a matching policy line and a recorded response. Nothing sat unresolved on rumor alone. The same councilman who had once called Ray's methods unfit for respectable homes stepped forward during the shelter rotation and asked to speak where everyone could hear. He did not ask forgiveness as a performance. He gave an accounting. He said he had watched her at the church meeting in January, had seen the way she kept her hands still when denied the floor, and had told himself silence meant uncertainty when in truth it had meant restraint. He admitted that he had taught younger men to equate comfort with wisdom and had therefore helped produce the very panic he later blamed on weather. Then he handed Owen a folded survey sheet for 2 new arrivals on the south lots, already marked for cellar depth, drainage pitch, vent shielding, and shared lane access, and said that no family under his ward line would enter winter without training if they accepted his oversight. Owen read the sheet, corrected 1 vent angle by a quarter turn, and nodded once. The correction was accepted publicly. So was the nod. In the afternoon, as the rope teams practiced blind travel between marker posts with scarves over their eyes, Edith Sorrell brought Clara Voss's key ring from the church chest and placed it on the slate table for the school monitors to pass hand to hand. Nora, now grown and teaching letters in the reopened schoolhouse, explained why it remained part of drill day. Keys, she told them, were not only for doors. They were for obligations that had to be carried even when wind erased landmarks. Each child then copied Clara's name, Amos Hale's name, Jonah Pike's name, and Ruthie Bell's name under the heading Winter Cost, and below that copied Ray Tucker's line from memory as town law rather than family proverb, store for weather, not for applause. Before sunset, Owen gathered the last station at the cedar board above the original hatch, and the crowd quieted in the way work crews quiet when they know the final instruction decides whether labor holds through dark. He did not offer saintly portraiture of his sister. He said her temper had been real, her hurt had been real, and her generosity had required structure because feeling alone could not feed 47 souls through 3 days of burial drift. He said she had never once asked him to excuse what had been done to them, and never once permitted him to turn that injury into refusal when hungry neighbors reached their door. Then he gave the rules she had repeated in her final years to anyone who asked whether the town had earned forgiveness. Forgiveness was not a receipt to be stamped. It was the shape of the next winter's labor. If they wanted it, they could dig, measure, seal, and share. No one applauded. They moved instead. Men and women lifted the final fuel bundles into the communal shed by weight class. Youth monitors recopied route maps and hung them in the church hall, the rail office, and the former Pemberton store. Now a cooperative counter with fixed emergency rates posted in plain view. The last borrowed jars were returned, inspected, and stacked. The original account books that had been spared from the stove were transferred to archive shelf with their misuse noted in the margin for students who studied civic failures. The odd details that had once been dismissed as superstition or fussiness were all indexed in the preparedness ledger under practical headings: wire hum, moon halo, thaw freeze axle risk, raven line shifts, dog refusal patterns, and chimney draft reversal under crosswind. Even the old derisive name remained, but only as a mapped location and historical lesson, stripped of contempt by repetition in service of life. The dugout still stands. In winter, its walls still hold near 55, while plains wine strips heat from careless lumber. In October, children still trace Owen's carved words with mittened fingers. At first, snow teamsters still test rope knots at the marker posts before taking freight north. Sage Hollow still counts souls each spring, and the count is followed by stores, fuel, and lane readiness, because population without preparation is only a number waiting for weather. They say build like Tucker in church minutes, in school copybooks, in freight contracts, and at kitchen tables where elders teach jar sealing by lamp glow. They mean depth, discipline, and early sharing. They mean that a town may begin by mocking its wisest labor and still choose through work and memory to become worthy of the life it was given.